Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Energy MD podcast. We're on a mission to help 1 million people increase their energy, decrease their fatigue so they can have more fun and success in every aspect of their lives. And as you know, we're looking at over 30 different causes. And a couple of those causes we're going to be talking about today with my good friend, Jenn. So let's learn about Jenn Malecha. So she supports busy, health-minded professionals in taking back control of their health by giving them access to the right lab tests and resources so they can find the missing pieces of their health puzzle, actually fix what is wrong, isn't that novel, and get back to feeling like themselves again. Using over a decade of personal training experience, training in functional diagnostic nutrition and transformational coaching, she creates personalized health rebuilding programs for clients that are realistic and sustainable for long-lasting results, and that empowers clients to be the boss of their own health. Jenn, thanks so much for joining me today.
I'm so excited to be here, Evan. It's great for us to be able to connect in this capacity and get some really important information out to people.
Absolutely. And you're a wealth of knowledge, always have been. So really excited about the tips that you're going to be sharing with folks today. So we're going to be talking about gut, liver, thyroid, detox. And I know you have your own personal thyroid story and you've helped a lot of people with thyroid. You want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the thing about thyroid that I always like to say to people is, your body doesn't just wake up one day and decide to be dysfunctional. Like your thyroid doesn't just decide that it's going to stop working or producing less thyroid hormone. Like we really have to ask the question of why is that happening? And, I reached a point in my health journey where I ran into that issue. I was dealing with hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's. And when I really dug in to figure out why that was happening, turns out it was a result of having some toxic mold in our home. And then the domino effect that can have. I mean, I know you talk a lot about toxins and mold and all kinds of things here, Evan, and the work that you do, the kind of impact that can have on the body, the toxic load that it produces has this domino effect that then impacts all these other systems of the body as well too. And I'm sure we're going to dive into that today. So, just to highlight a few things for the listeners here is, for one, toxic mold can elevate estrogen in the body. So along with having a dysfunctional thyroid situation, I was also dealing with some estrogen dominance, and those things kind of correlate together. And along with that was dealing with a lot of liver congestion and gut dysfunction stuff that was happening from that mold exposure that had been going on in my house. And it had been going on for quite some time until we discovered it. And that's kind of the tricky thing about mold, is it's so stealth, right? Like it can be hiding in between the walls, like in spaces that we don't really think to think about. And fortunately, I did find it and then was able to quickly take action and reverse its effects over time. So happy to say that now I don't have thyroid issues, and I was able to get in remission with Hashimoto's within 6 months of the discovery. So I can't wait to share some insights for people on this topic, so to help people do the same kind of thing.
Excellent. And so you're talking about, for people who are listening, thyroid's really this combination of autoimmunity against the thyroid, right? And then the low thyroid as well. And so, toxins will cause that autoimmunity. What would you say is the main toxin that ends up triggering autoimmune thyroid issues?
Oh my gosh, I don't know that there is a main toxin because there are so many in our environment. How would you even track that down? If we think about the toxic load that our body is encountering in this state of time, it's more so than any other time in human population, right? So we know that ever since World War II, there's been a rapid introduction of toxins into our environment. And, as we're sitting here recording this podcast, the recent events in East Palestine and Ohio are just an example of toxic spillage and exposures, contamination of our water, our ground, our animals, our air that's happening. And that's just one thing that got highlighted in the media. There's stuff like this that's going on all the time, let alone just the everyday production of products that we use in our households. And so we're hit with hundreds of thousands of toxins every single day, potentially in our environment. So to track one down specifically, it's really hard. I kind of like to look at it as the load over time becomes so heavy that the body can't bear it anymore. And then we start to see this breakdown of systems within the body, like the immune system becomes overstimulated or overloaded, as well as the detoxification system. So we can't even get these things out of the body. And it's this vicious cycle that starts to happen inside the body. And it's kind of like that old adage we say, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know that we'll ever know what the answer to that question is. But ultimately, we can take like a 10,000-foot view and look at all the contributing factors and start to recognize and be conscious of what our body is being exposed to on a regular basis and how it's having that impact, and start to unravel some of these things to restore balance and health to our body overall.
Amen.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're talking about total body load, total mass effect from all these different toxins. And it sounds like for you, the main linchpin was mold. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say something like that is, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, right? Because what's really interesting is when I go back through my own personal history, and as I got into kind of the functional medicine, functional health space back in 2012, what has been a reoccurring theme on a lot of my personal lab tests is liver congestion. And part of the precipice of what got me into this industry was that I was actually diagnosed with skin cancer at the age of like 25. And I had studied fitness nutrition and health in college. I have a degree in kinesiology. I was working in the fitness industry. I thought that I was the healthiest person that I knew. I was doing all the quote unquote right things. And there was really no rhyme or reason as to why I had cancer. Like, there wasn't any family history or anything of the sorts that could link back to the scenario. So that's when I dove into the functional medicine space, ran some functional lab tests on myself, discovered that I had really high like urinary bile acids, so an indication or correlation with liver congestion, had really high oxidative stress, which is cellular damage going on in the body. I had overgrowth of bacteria, parasites, yeast kind of stuff going on in my digestive system, adrenal or cortisol imbalances. So kind of this perfect storm and culmination of dysfunction that was happening in the body that was expressing itself in the form of skin cancer, ultimately, right? And so from early on in my history, like, the moral of the story here is that from early on, there were indications of a load that was happening in my body already. And when I think back about, growing up as a child, like, my dad was a smoker, and he was, conscious. He would smoke outside, and in the car, he would smoke with the window down. But we know now that even that secondhand cigarette smoke is, super toxic, and it probably hasn't gotten enough media or publicity as it should. And those are the kinds of things that early on in our life we're getting exposed to, and then all the things in our environment, that it becomes this cumulative load over time. And then when you have then something like, a really intense kind of frequent exposure to mold, like I did in my house, there was already a burden there. And this was that straw that broke the camel's back, I think.
Well said. So oftentimes with skin, what we're seeing is that if the toxins can't get out of the body and the normal detoxification pathways, they try to get out of the largest detox organ, which is the skin, right?
Right.
So then what do people need to do in order to help themselves get these toxins out of their body? And then we'll talk about how to avoid exposure.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that the first step to do, and especially if we relate this or simulate it to a mold exposure, is to remove the toxin from the environment as much as possible, right? It's starting to recognize what the exposures are, and we can dive deeper into removing some exposures. But that is the first, like, one of the most important things is, how do we minimize exposure overall? And what are some of the steps that we can do that? The second thing is then just recognizing that even with the minimization of exposures, is that you can't control all the toxins that you are exposed to. You can't live in a bubble. That's not a realistic state of being, right? Like, there's going to be times when you're going to get in a car, get in a plane, go to other people's houses, be out in public. And every time we do those things, we're exposed to toxins. So then you got to look at, okay, well, how can I offset or mitigate some of that exposure? So that can mean simple things like moving your body on a daily basis, sweating. That's one of the ways that we get toxins out of the body. making sure that you are drinking adequate amount of water, because we know that toxins have to be attached to water molecules to be excreted out of the body through urine and stool and sweat. Making sure that you're having bowel movements every day, because that's one of the biggest ways that we eliminate toxins from the body, right? So that's super important. Then we can look at things like different foods that we can incorporate that boost liver function, detoxification. They have these naturally detoxifying properties. And then we can also level up from there and look at supplements, other maybe what I would say are like advanced practices like coffee enemas and different things that we can be doing to really support the body's natural detoxification system and moving some of that stuff out, basically.
Excellent. So then let's go back to the thyroid. And one of the things you mentioned before we got on today is you said that, like me, you see a lot of people who their thyroid, they're being undertreated for thyroid. Um, and so you had mentioned that there are some other things to consider in order to optimize thyroid function. I think that's what you were talking about, right? Remind me.
Yes, 100%. And I see this a lot in my practice. So a lot of the cases that I see in my practice are, one, people who've already been diagnosed with a thyroid problem and they're taking thyroid medication, but they haven't exactly noticed a significant improvement in how they're feeling. They're still struggling with weight, energy, hair loss, like any of the thyroid symptoms. Maybe they've gotten a little bit of relief, but those things are still evident to them. Or the other scenario is people who they have been told that they have a thyroid issue, but they don't want to take medication. So they're looking for natural alternatives. And I would say the third case is people who don't know that they have a thyroid issue going on. But when we dive into our work together, we can recognize the correlations of imbalances. And so whatever the scenario is, we can then look at, well, how can we actually help support the thyroid so that either continued thyroid imbalances or medication can be avoided? And even in a lot of cases, how can we better support thyroid function to maybe reduce the utilization of medication? And a lot of cases with my clients, they eventually are able to get off of it by supporting it naturally. And this is where toxins in the environment are a huge factor in this. And most importantly too, the connection between the liver and the gut, the digestive system, as it relates to overall thyroid function. Like, these are some of the biggest healing opportunities that your typical endocrinologist is not going to be addressing when they're working with you with your thyroid, because in our traditional standard of care system, we have specific areas of expertise where an endocrinologist is just working on hormones. It's very rare that you're going to find one that's also looking at the detoxification and digestive system. Like, they would refer you out to a gastroenterologist or somebody else to work on those pieces, and they're not really collaborating and talking together. And we know that the body is a complex network of systems that all work together. So we do want to start to take a more holistic approach or view of what's happening in the body to truly understand the opportunity that somebody has to feel better, basically.
Mm-hmm. And what do you like to do to support the thyroid? Do you like to support other hormones? Are there certain nutrients that you find helpful?
Yeah, I like to take that 10,000 foot view and really recognize the interaction of the different systems of the body. So when I work with somebody, we usually run a series of lab tests that are more functional based, taking a look at things that blood tests don't always pick up on. So a lot of times these tests are urine or stool or saliva or even hair sample based. And I like to get a big picture looking at the hormone, digestion, immune, detoxification, energy, and nervous system together to collect as many clues as possible. My mentor, Reed Davis from FDN's, he always describes this really well. If you had, a private investigator or a detective come over to your house because there was a crime scene of some sorts, they wouldn't just look in the attic or the basement. They would look at the whole house for all of the clues, right? So we want to look at the body in the same way. Like, why would you only look at one specific area? Let's look at the whole thing and collect all the clues. And when we do this, we can then start to see the correlations. So for example, on a hormone test. I like to use the Dutch test. We can then start to see what's going on with the rest of the hormone balance. Like I mentioned earlier, estrogen, was a clue for me, that estrogen dominance. So recognizing the correlation that has between thyroid and balance. On that specific test, we can also look at phase 1 estrogen metabolism, which gives us some insights to liver function. Ultimately, we can also then see cortisol regulation and rhythm on there, which the adrenals and the thyroid have a close connection with each other, how they support and help to balance each other, right? And we can look at things like a stool sample test. Like I love the GI map. We can start to get some insights as to what's going on in the digestive system, inflammation, different types of bacteria overgrowth. It's, impacting the ability to digest nutrients really well. It's also creating an inflammatory load on the immune system that can be some of those things that are contributing to an autoimmune circumstance. And all this kind of links back to the thyroid because one, we need nutrients. We need the right types of nutrients in the right amount to produce thyroid hormone adequately, and acknowledging that a big majority of, or a big portion of thyroid hormone, specifically thyroid T4, is converted into T3 in liver and digestive tissue. And so this is where I see a lot of people get better, Evan, is when we focus on kind of working to balance all the systems of the body, especially with an emphasis on liver function, detoxification, as well as improving digestion or healing the gut, so that one, they can absorb nutrients better, so that they can adequately produce hormones, they can adequately have enough energy for cellular function and other things going on in the body, but then also so that that conversion of T4 to T3 can optimally occur, which is, I would say the majority of the thyroid cases that I've come across in my practice in general has been hypothyroidism. So it's low T3 typically. And so we got to ask the question of, well, why is there low T3? And it can be a conversion issue that's actually happening. And then we can see if there's a low amount of T4, then that's probably an indication or correlation with poor nutrient absorption. So we're not able to make it as well as we could be, right?
Mm-hmm. If it is a conversion issue, what do you like to use to convert from T4 to T3?
So one of the primary nutrients for that is selenium. That's going to be super helpful for that conversion. I try to be really mindful of supplementation and just, like how much can somebody take on and all the other things that we're doing. So I really like to focus in on, also instead of supplementing sometimes with like specific nutrients, like I might use something like selenium in the beginning because I know that they're lacking in that, while we focus on improving digestion and improving liver function, which is ultimately going to help bring the nutrients in and then help with the conversion state as well there too.
Excellent. So I see a lot of people who have worked for years sometimes on healing their gut.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes it's not until they get rid of the heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections that they're actually able to do that. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, I think it's a progressive process. So I always like to start people with like, what is the low hanging fruit? And a lot of times that is, what are the foods that they're eating? So they might be like, I like to do food sensitivity testing. And so looking at those inflammatory factors, do they have an overgrowth of parasites, bacteria, and yeast that we can initially work to clean up? Sleep cycles, improving their sleep cycles so that the body can adequately like repair and detoxify at nighttime, balancing some of those hormones, improving, liver function so that it can start to move some of that stuff out of the body. And I find that when we focus on some of that, those foundational steps with people, a lot of people make really great progress in those areas. And then with a percentage of the people that I work with, once we go through those things, if they're either not making progress in the way that I would anticipate them to, or we want to make further progress, we kind of start to dive deeper into the metals and the molds and other things, which, from my perspective, is a great next step because they've created like a really solid foundation by addressing some of those initial things like their diet, their sleep routine, exercise, generally supporting detoxification, improving gut health, like starting to progress in that area, where now the body is at a better place to have the capacity and the resiliency to actually maybe detox like deeper with pulling metals out of tissues and like moving some of that stuff out of the body. But 100%, like those things are, again, factors that we have to consider, especially when we take a look again at what is in our environment and what we're being exposed to. So, another thing in that low-hanging fruit is going back to what we said earlier, is just, first of all, let's start with minimizing exposure to that stuff, right? Like improving food quality, eating organic, making sure that we're drinking like distilled or filtered water to start minimizing, that type of stuff. So we're reducing the load on the body, giving it some space to heal, making some progress, making some lifestyle changes, and really setting it up for success with some of maybe these deeper detox approaches.
Yeah, I think most people don't realize how toxic their water is. They're trusting their municipal system to actually filter it correctly. But if people go to ewg.org/citywater and they put in their zip code, it's kind of amazing. My mom actually recently went back to Massachusetts, and then she got a tremor several days later, and we kind of looked and we saw, how so many of these things are off the charts, 5 times, 10 times, 300 times the normal acceptable ranges of these toxins. And I put her on distilled water, and her tremor went away in a number of days. And so,
Right.
yeah, it's just, and I've seen that time and time again. So just such an important emphasis for sure. Now, in terms of parasites, you were mentioning, you were talking about parasites, important part of all this. I rarely find parasites on laboratory tests. And so oftentimes we have to look at history and symptoms. How do you like to find parasites?
I approach it in both ways. So in the training that I've received, the thing that we always say is you treat the person, not the test results, right? So we have to recognize that a test is a snapshot in time, right? That, even if you look at thyroid, for example, your thyroid levels are changing like every minute of the day. And that one time that you took that blood test is just what you're capturing. So I definitely, like, when it comes to capturing parasites, I love the GI map stool sample test, but it's not always reflecting what the person is feeling. And so if a test comes back clean or lacking, what I'm suspecting, then I have to correlate that back to the person. And I literally have run side-by-side stool sample tests sometimes to get a greater perspective on things. So when it comes to stool sample testing, there's essentially 2 different methodologies to it. There is like PCR testing, where they're looking at genetic data, which is what the GI map is kind of centered around, versus microscopic testing, which I think Genova FX uses microscopic testing methods. And definitely back in the day, I used to use BioHealth, their 401H test, and they were using microscopy sampling as well too. So microscopy sampling basically opens it up for anything to be detected, because they're putting it under a microscope on a petri dish, and they're like, seeing what's just going to grow and proliferate. There's kind of no limit to it in a sense. At the same time, there's a lot of room. Sometimes there can be room for error with that. Like, the samples have to be shipped like temperature safe, and then getting it back into the lab and being able to cultivate the organisms on the petri dish to detect those things, right? So there's room for error. And then the PCR test is a little bit limited, and that they're looking for very specific things, but also can be more definite. So I've seen people, have really strong symptomology for parasites or H. pylori, and sometimes it comes up clean on a microscopy test, and I pick it up on a PCR, and vice versa. I've seen it go both ways. So I think, to your point, Evan, is that the most important thing is that we can't discredit what a client or somebody is feeling just because of a test result. We have to correlate that information back to them. And we know with some of the other assessments and analysis that we do, just asking people questions, looking at their history and their intake, something like bruxism, teeth grinding, is a very strong correlation with things like parasite and yeast overgrowth. And so we can and look at the history of that, the onset of that. I also like to, I don't know if you do this in your practice, but look at the correlation between the full moon cycles, because I've noticed that during full moon cycles, symptom intensity is up. And so that can also be a correlating factor as well too. So then we can go in and we can address those things regardless of what the lab tests say sometimes.
Absolutely. And then, looking at the history, if somebody did get, has ever had Montezuma's Revenge or traveler's diarrhea or anything like that, I mean, you can get parasites living in the United States as well, but oftentimes, that's a really good indicator, because even if you had it treated or whatever, like the likelihood that it was treated completely is very low.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you said that about, making a determination or a diagnosis based off of somebody's history and symptoms. This is like one of the main things that I learned from medical school that's actually true, is that 90% of your diagnosis really should be history plus symptoms. It shouldn't be labs, right?
Right. Which is unfortunately the opposite of what probably the actual approach is. Because how many people have said, and I experienced this too, like my lab tests always came back quote unquote normal, but I didn't feel that way. I was tired all the time, was struggling to like maintain my weight. I was having really, alongside of this skin cancer diagnosis, I was having what I know now to call like chemical sensitivities, like strong reactions to perfume, or like the smell of a permanent marker made me super nauseous one time. And so, we can see those accumulations over time happening. And that's all the symptomology that somebody like you and I would look at. But, in the standard of care, they're just looking at the labs and not taking some of those things into consideration. And a lot of times people are being told it's all in their head, and it's actually not,
Right. Yeah, I call that medical trauma and malpractice. Unfortunately, way too many people have been told that it's all in their head, and the reality is it's not. So
Exactly.
I'm glad you said that. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about lab testing, normal ranges versus optimal ranges.
Oh, it's so misleading. Like the main points of this is to recognize that reference ranges that we get on lab testing are usually established based on averages of all kinds of demographics of people, sick people as well as healthy people. We can take a look at like thyroid specifically. A lot of the studies that were done to establish those reference ranges, which Dr. Amy Myers talks about pretty extensively in some of her books, is those studies were done with people who were already hypothyroid or on medication, so they don't actually reflect what healthy truly is.
Right.
But also they don't, aside from that, they don't reflect what optimal is. And so when we look at those ranges, they're very wide. And in the work that's, people like you and I do, we're looking at more narrow ranges to determine, well, what is optimal? Where are you actually going to feel your best? What would be a healthy range for that to happen? So we have to, I love educating people on these factors, because so many people are told, like I was, that your labs look normal. They look perfect. You're within range. My doctor would tell me all the time, you're the picture of perfect health. But I was being compared to those really wide ranges and not what an actual optimal range, aside from the fact that those ranges are established based on sick people a lot of times and not actually healthy people.
Mhm. So let's talk about yeast and mold. So they're both fungal illnesses. How can you tell the difference about whether or not somebody's suffering from one or the other, or sometimes if they have both?
I think most of the times that they have both. I find it really rare that they don't actually have both, because when we're exposed to mold, again, going back to the burden that it places on the body, the internal toxicity and inflammation that it creates, the suppression on the immune system, the way that it loads the liver and the detoxification system. And then we get these things that are backed up in the body. I mean, we could go down the rabbit hole of the domino effect that happens, like the increase in oxalates and the diminishing levels of minerals that really, make you more susceptible to yeast overgrowth specifically, right? And also depending on the type of mold spores in which you're exposed to can really set you up for yeast. So I find that usually people actually have both. Well, I should say that if they've been exposed to mold, they have both, right? Like that's the typical case that I see that we have to clean up. Versus the people, not everybody who has yeast, in my experience, has had mold exposure. That's definitely not, not always the case. But I find if they've had mold exposure, they definitely typically have yeast for sure. How about you in your experience? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I find it to be very common. And so I'm not entirely sure, which came first. I mean, obviously there's the mold exposure, but in terms of who's feeding whom
Right.
potentially. Um, and so that was going to be my next question for you, is that oftentimes I'll find, if somebody's got yeast, the way that I treat yeast, I'm going to use oftentimes antifungals, among other things. But if I give them antifungals too soon and they haven't gotten rid of enough of their mold, I find that they get worse. And I'm curious
Yeah.
yeah, that's been your experience.
Yeah, because it's kind of like, you're giving them a life raft to stay afloat, but they're not actually making any progress to the island or to land, right?
Mhm.
And so, and it goes back to just minimizing the exposure. So even though you're treating the fungal stuff, they're still getting like slammed with waves of toxic burden. And so their body is trying to break down. Like we have to also recognize that when we are addressing things like parasites, bacteria, yeast in the body, in the gut, and maybe doing an antifungal protocol, we're actually breaking down toxins in the body and asking the body to eliminate those things, right? Because you're killing off whatever that pathogen is. So if we still have the same burden of toxic load coming in, as well as now we're breaking down toxin and trying to pass all of that out, I think it can overload the system, and then people, they get a backup in their detoxification system. I like to relate it to my clients like rush hour traffic, right? You're releasing all the cars at the same time, but there's only 2 lanes that everybody gets to go through the freeway and exit off of. So we want to be conscious about like, we can open up more lanes if we kind of work on supporting the detoxification system first, and then coming in and doing the eradication work essentially, but also like making sure that that we're minimizing that external burden so they're not having to deal with too many things all at once.
Mhm. Agreed. Excellent. So, those were most of my questions. What have I not covered that you want to make sure our listeners learn today?
I want to go back to, I think we said we were going to circle back to this, is, kind of the approach of minimizing toxins from your environment, because for the listeners and a lot of people, when we start to talk about just the insane number of toxins that are in the environment, it can be really overwhelming for people. You're like, where do I start? And a lot of my clients feel that way too. So I'd like to share kind of how I help people prioritize toxin elimination so that you can progressively move through it in a step-by-step process. And so I say that the first priority is minimizing toxins that are going into your body. So that's where we prioritize food and water, right? So anything that's going directly into your body is going to have an immediate and instant impact on what's happening internally. And this is some, again, that low hanging fruit. And along with this, we also want to take a look at what is touching our food, like food containers, cooking utensils that is then potentially contaminating our food and our drinking water that's going inside of the body. So handle those things first. That is going to have almost an instant or immediate kind of positive impact on the body and start to move the needle for you. And then I say, next, focus on things that go on your body, because whatever we're putting on our body gets absorbed through the skin. It still has to be metabolized through the liver and the digestive system and the detoxification system. So this is where we can then start to expand out and take a look at personal care products, soaps, lotions, shampoo, conditioner, stuff that we're utilizing, as well as this is where I would address water again, your shower water and your bathing water, because relating this back to the topic of thyroid that we've been talking about today, the chlorine, the fluoride, the bromelain in our water that we get exposed to, whether through drinking it or through bathing in it, actually combine to thyroid hormone and make it unavailable. So this is something that can impact those thyroid values and how the thyroid's functioning in the body. So we can, put like a shower filter on or filters on our bath water. You can look at a whole house filtration system, which is something that I eventually invested in when we did our remodel, and really start to minimize then things that you put on your body. And then I say the third space, with the exception of mold, maybe and some other things, is that starting to look at, your external environment. So this is like cleaning products, paint that you're using. And this is where I really think that, you can look at this as a journey. It's like it's not about ditching everything in your house and having to take on a huge investment of cleaning stuff out. It's like, okay, when you run out of that cleaning solution, swap it for something that is less toxic or non-toxic. Or, I feel like I've been in this work for a while. Like we've had a Tempur-Pedic bed for 10 years, which is super toxic. Bought it before I knew anything about functional medicine. And we decided this year was time to get a new bed. So in this turnover, I did all the research to get a non-toxic, 100% organic latex bed, right? We're going to eventually get a new couch. So I'll be getting like more of a non-toxic couch that doesn't have flame retardants on it. So this is where I think you could start to chip away at some of those environmental toxins. And I say with the exception of mold, because as we've been talking about today, something like mold is a massive burden on the body. So that's not something that you should wait to address. It needs to be prioritized right away. And also if you have any other really kind of big, intense, toxic exposures to metals or other chemicals, you probably want to tackle those real quick as well too, and not let those things linger. Right.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Thank you for that.
Awesome.
So this has been really excellent. I appreciate you sharing all this information. Where can people go to learn more about you, get educated on what you're doing?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. I love connecting with people and continuing these conversations over on Instagram. Feel free to message me, come over, comment on some of the posts that I share with information like this to get some insights and coaching on that kind of stuff. My Instagram handle is Holistic Health Boss, which is with a W, like whole food, basically. I also write a really regular blog every other week, providing all kinds of insights and information like stuff that we talked about today. So you guys can find me over at holistichealthboss.com. Check out the blog series that I have about mold and thyroid and things like that. And even jump on my newsletter list so you can get that stuff delivered to your inbox all the time.
Excellent. And then you also have a free gift for our listeners.
Yeah,
the toxins checklist.
It's a super actionable item based on what we talked about today. It basically helps you kind of assess, the environmental things that we talked about today, personal care products, food sources, other things that might be going on in your home and your environment. So you can go through the checklist, kind of score yourself, see what is my toxic load right now? And then it also then gives you insights on actionable things that you can do. So then you can prioritize and say, okay, I'm going to tackle one toxic element from the checklist that's in my environment, like a month or a week or whatever that might be for you. And you can reutilize the checklist over time to continue reevaluating and seeing how you're reducing that load over time.
So actionable. And I just applaud, the baby steps approach. You just a little bit, every single day, if you're doing something, every single month, if you make one of those commitments to make some of those changes in the home, so important.
Exactly. As the saying goes, small hinges swing really big doors. So the little stuff totally counts.
Well, that's good. I haven't heard that one before. I'm gonna have to use it. It's a good one.
You can use it.
Jenn, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been excellent.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Evan. Great conversation.
I hope you learned something on today's podcast. If you did, please share it with your friends and family and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It's really helpful for getting this information out to more people who desperately need it. Sharing all the experts I know and love and the powerful tips I have is one of my absolute favorite things to do. Thanks for being part of my community. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. It is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Thanks for listening and have an amazing day.